Let's welcome our political commentators today. It's Dale Husband and Brigitte Morten. Kia ora korua, thanks for being here.
Tēnā koe, Kathryn, and kia ora to you as well, Brigitte. Ngā mihi.
Dale Husband's a long-time broadcaster and Radio Wātea presenter hosting a current affairs program. Brigitte Morten's a director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, a National Party member and does volunteer for the party's deputy leader during elections. Waitangi Day and the politics thereof. Look, plenty of hours, column inches, vision about this, but interested in some of the highlights and the standout for you, for better or worse. Dale?
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to be there, Kano here for the first time, because normally I'm broadcasting out of Auckland and linking there. So, Kathryn, I really enjoyed the experience. I thought that our people shone, especially our rangatahi, and while we focus on some of the drama, and there's plenty of that, there was also an absolute magic that really just descended upon that settlement. And there was an air of positivity there. There was an air of challenge, obviously, which we witnessed, and the images have been beamed globally. But really, when we look at our young people and their pride in our Māori ways, it was on show left, right and centre, on the water, in the Rangatahi Forum tent, where there was some very challenging kōrero aired. And when we got to the pai, turning the back on Seymour's speech, I didn't think he read the room very well. In fact, maybe he should have heeded the call from his own iwi not even to attend. And when we consider the raft of policies in the last year, the government really got off pretty lightly. There was some heckling, but nothing overly untoward. And the policies that are being advanced by this coalition government in their first year and a half are going to impact us as a people for decades to come. Many saying that we're feeling like refugees in our own land, and with this international trend, this lurch to the right, we've been caught up in it here in New Zealand. So interesting to see the challenges from our young people with the Toitū Te Tiriti activation, the wahine in red blankets, a symbol of the colonisation of the Pacific, turning their backs on some of the political rhetoric. It was outstanding, but let's just realise that we're in the midst of some serious hits on what we hold dear as a people, and the repercussions of that are going to last a lifetime.
Brigitte?
Yeah, I agree with Dale that it was a very positive Waitangi Day celebration, and I celebrate those sort of democratic, peaceful protests. I think it really shows who we are as a nation, the fact that people can have some very strong views and very valid strong views and still turn up and debate. And so where I disagree with Dale is whether or not David Seymour should have turned up. I think regardless of whether you agree or disagree with him, and I certainly do personally disagree with him on the Treaty Principles Bill, for him to face up to the music and be willing to stand there, I think shows a lot about him and him standing on his values. I do think it was the right decision for the Prime Minister to not be there. I think that took some of that heat out of that situation and actually flowed really well into that narrative that he is trying to put out there of positive and constructive. And he was still challenged down in Akaroa, and as appropriately so, but it took some of that sort of that conflict that we've seen previously. And I've been up in Waitangi, with ministers previously, and it can be a very heated place and doesn't come away with a positive feeling. And my impression this time is that has actually been flipped on its head a little bit.
I mean, interesting you make the point about David Seymour, and he did go there and he did face up and front up, but I was interested in Claire Trevette's reporting that he also had his personal mic on for his social media when his mic was taken off him, if her reporting is accurate. So it's also part, isn't it, of keeping up the messaging you want for core supporters, as well as your...
I think all politicians did social media while they're up there. I think social media was a pretty strong vehicle. So I'm not sure whether that sort of says anything about, I don't think he exclusively needs to just talk through the microphone that is put in front of him. And, of course, there are some people that are wanting to listen to him that were not present, so therefore that's how they can do that. I don't think it makes any difference, really, whether or not he's got a social media broadcast and whether he's talking to his supporters or people want to hear him defending the Treaty Principles Bill.
I guess
part
my
of the
point
debate.
is it's politics. You can't take the politics out of politics. It was the same at the the same also at the hikoi. You know, you can talk to a crowd, but you can also talk to people, you know, through your particular channel who are interested in
8%
your
Dave,
messaging.
Kathryn. He's milking it for everything he can get. He's trying to usurp and grandstand and take away the mana of the PM's role. And Chris Luxon, he must just be shaking his head in disbelief at this bloke. And like many people saying it was courageous for him to turn up. Hey, this is Waitangi Day. Read the room, David. Read the room.
I think the other issue with the Prime Minister, and again reading New Zealand Herald's reporting through Audrey Young this time, talking about the strength of Justin Tipa's speech there. Yes, a less confrontational environment for Christopher Luxon, but is this also about whether or not his depth of understanding, reading, and the recent history of this huge issue for the country is a little exposed? He was out of the country for 16 years when so much change was happening, and listening to that speech, hearing again about how we need to be a country that says no and yes and not no or whatever. Is it also a way of managing that perhaps this isn't his strong suit, Bridget?
I think, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, actually, to be honest. But I think for him...
Is it exposing that these matters are not the Prime Minister's strong suit in terms of depth of understanding of recent history here?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this is not his strength. His strength is absolutely in the economic and in the business conversations and, you know, the economy and getting things back on track. That is his strong point. And you can see why he would be focusing on that. But you also can see why he's focusing on that because the polls, which I no doubt we'll get to shortly, are telling him that this is what New Zealanders want to hear. I think we need to be careful. It sort of pops up every time year around Waitangi Day, that rightly so, this is an important discussion and debate and time for reflection that we have. But for most New Zealanders, it is not the number one issue that is affecting them. And therefore, the Prime Minister, as a Prime Minister for all of New Zealand, has to reflect that back. This was another opportunity in which he needs to get that narrative out there about, you know, economic growth and getting the economy and helping households.
All right. Now, the other matter to come out around this day was the Party Māori and its Treaty Commissioner. Bottom line, I think, was the phrase it used for forming a government. And the thing about this particular iteration, if I understand it correctly, Dale, is that Treaty Commissioner would effectively have veto rights over parliamentary decisions. Now, that puts Labour in a pretty interesting position. I think its leader came out straight away and said, not going to go there if there are veto rights. Your take, Dale?
Yeah, well, initially I thought, well, where did this idea surface from? Has it been well discussed through the Māori world? And let's face it, Te Pāti Māori have had some suggestions which haven't got traction, one of them being that we should be a neutral country. So some might see this as an extreme call. Either way, it was reported as being a bottom line to any future arrangements. But then when questioned on it again, but Debbie Ngāruapaka said, well, anything that affects the treaty is a bottom line to us. So it's sort of caught up in semantics a little there, but there is a mood among some Māori who suggest that such an important issue really should have been taken to the people for more consultation. I mean, could it be overridden by parliamentary process? We've got a tribunal that only has recommendatory powers as well, so another layer of bureaucracy might not be as welcome as the party are suggesting. So, you know, the battleground's in the middle, and these extreme viewpoints, as are advanced at times by our left-leaning politicians and right-leaning, perhaps are just making up a little bit of political noise rather than what could be meaningful down the middle track. It caught many by surprise, and as such, the reaction wasn't wholehearted.
Interesting.
And supportive.
The reason it's so relevant is because, as we've been discussing, we're in a political era where those third parties are holding an unusually high proportion of the overall vote, and on both sides of the electoral divide at the moment. National is going to need 2 mates and Labour's going to need 2 mates. So all of a sudden bottom lines become interesting, don't they?
Yeah, and I don't think there's any semantics about what was proposed here. This is a very radical proposal in which you would have an unelected person deemed to veto anything that is going through an elected body that is our parliament. It is extreme, and I think it would be very worrying for Labour. I don't think Labour came out as strongly as they needed to. There was some weasel words from Hipkins there, not in the way they defined it, which indicates that he's still willing to have some sort of role in which there could be, availability of sort of this treaty kind of overlay. So I think Labour has got to get really clear on what is their bottom lines in terms of dealing with Te Pāti Māori, because it is really clear from their rhetoric that they are willing to go hard and to go quite far down a treaty provisions point of view, so that most of middle New Zealand is not going to accept, and particularly those voters that Labour needs to get back.
It's infuriating though, isn't it, Bridget, that Māori are forced to track down a line, a parliamentary process, a democratic process that has been foisted upon us. We didn't have any invitation to its structure. We set up a tribunal. That was only 45 years ago, 50 maybe, and that's been overlooked numerous times. So it's one thing to say, oh, come on, you Māori, you've got to tag along this process we've established. We're being good for you. We've set up this parliament for you. 4 seats in its initial setup. Lack of democracy from the start. And it's treated Māori and people of colour and culture way different, this setup of our parliamentary system, right from the get-go. And you can understand why people are fighting to find alternate ways that could be better. I think we run the risk, if we're sort of overly dismissive of ideas that might seem radically politically, but are yet to be tried.
All right. Let's come back to what's are turning up consistently as the top concerns on many people's minds when polled. Public services, and particularly health, obviously, and also the state of the economy and their personal pockets. Treasury getting more and more clear that as things are looking, the budget's tightness will lead to service cuts. Bridget.
Yeah, interesting headline there. It took me, I will confess, a bit of time to unpack exactly what they were saying. And when you look through that article, they're talking about in that sort of medium term. And there's some debate, and if you go into the depths of that article, there is a lot of discussion about whether or not you can actually forecast out that level. I think there is no doubt that there's absolute budget pressure to try and get the books back under control but maintain public services. I think everyone in that beehive is absolutely aware of that tension. I'm not entirely sure whether this Treasury forecasting actually assists with actually moving that debate forward at all. I think if I was thinking about it more from a public's point of view, I'd be focusing on, say, particular public services. So we know in health, for instance, we saw that the CE last week resigned. They're going through a period of change. I think for most New Zealanders, that's really they're going to be looking for. Those bottom lines, how long are they waiting in the emergency department, those sort of things.
Bridget, sorry, but we had Treasury's chief economist on last week about an earlier speech where he said broadly the same thing. He said on the current track, that's all you've got, is what the current government has set out in its forward budgets. In the current track, the cuts per person spending on social services would be almost unprecedented in modern times. Now, yes, governments can change their mind. They're going to say we can have a bunch of new taxes, or we could suddenly have the stellar economic growth we'd all love to land sometime between now and the election. I'm sure National would. But they were stating the fact in this massive budget that the current track was high per person cuts to services.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that they can only do it on the assumptions, and this is my understanding, on the assumption is what is put before them in terms of forecasting. And as they get further out, that forecasting gets more difficult. And so I don't think you can say there is definitely conservative cuts, but I absolutely agree with you. As I go back to, there is a tension about where the new spending can be and how much new spending can be sustained.
There's hardly any to spend, Dale, based on last year's budgets for
when you look at what the kids are getting for lunch, and we should, as a nation, give ourselves an uppercut for not sorting out the ferry issue. There's $500 million there. But I do take your point, Bridget. How the heck are we going to prophesise what the economy might be like in 10 or 15 years? I mean, we can't change the past. and we can't really anticipate the future because of all the volatility that is in front of us. So we can really only operate on a day-to-day basis. I, like you, Bridget, was pretty confused by the higher fuel and these long-range forecasts, and wonder whether or not it's an opportunity to employ people who are crystal ball gazers. But at the moment, what we do know is that there have been 20,000 jobs gone. We've got people marched down the road, left, right, centre. Aussie is becoming increasingly attractive, and now we just open up the gates. And again, here's us Māori people, the kicking ball, the political football, and now we say, righto, we're going to fast track everything. Any input you had to the RMA about what you hold dear is now disregarded and overridden, and now the welcome mat out for the rich investors who are going to come in with their millions. We know which way they're going to vote when they come in. Haere mai, they say. You don't have to speak English, and I too am fearful that they'll bring their money in and just go and buy a swag of houses down the residential streets of our land. And that's hardly helping any of us.
All right. The Finance Minister, also pivoting from the spending cuts narrative to tax cuts, this time for business, wants to be bold. There's some smaller adjustments that are being considered that might again help ease the path for investors, or in some instances Kiwis wanting to come home who have overseas assets. But the biggie, because it is a fair whack of change, is the corporate tax, the potential for a corporate tax move.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just have to be quite realistic on this in terms of looking at how we compete internationally, and those, the island figure of 12.5 and Singapore is 17 while we sit at 28. It is clearly an issue that we need to address. Very difficult to address, of course, because we've just as talked about the budget constraints that we do have. I was also pleased to see, though, some of the rhetoric coming through around some of those compliance costs. So how fringe benefit tax is dealt with, how depreciation, all of those sort of things that really tie up businesses, particularly as a small business nation, in a lot of red tape, I think is really important for them to address as well.
Dale.
Well, 2% of the people own 50% of DOSH in this country as well. 28% corporate tax. You'll be paying more than that yourself, Bridget. I am at times as well. Joe from Civvy Street gets nailed each and every time by the IRD, but the way that the corporate structures are managed, the clever accounting that goes on, 28% to many of us would be a fair tax. And I know you're trying to marry up with other jurisdictions globally, but it's not something that really comes on the radar, to be honest, of many of the people that we communicate with on our platform. And for those, I say, working class people in New Zealand, while it might sound good to Wellingtonians and public servants and their flash lifestyles, it's not something that you're hearing talking about on the streets of Mundarao or in the shopping aisles of Pack and Save.
The Kāinga Ora reset plan again has come up for some criticism as to whether this is just going to lead to fewer houses being built, basically. Your take on it, Dale?
I sound like a grumpy old guy, don't I? I grew up in a state house, so I sort of know how they came to be. It infuriates me that the ones that are dotted in our well-heeled suburbs now are to be sold off, and they'll go to developers, will corral the rest of the plebs into the lower price range houses and ghettoise many. So there's nothing really that's been achieved. I don't know how many houses have actually been built. When I looked at the stats, I thought, well, that don't add up very, very well. So no, it's not something that we haven't heard before. And let's bear in mind too, Kathryn, that most of these politicians weren't born before the 80s. They're talking about privatising and getting rid of state-owned assets. These are all things that have been tried before, and we just need more time to protect assets. And we're seeing the suffocation of many. And as far as the housing stock's concerned, well, I'd say if they're going to sell them off, there's also some consideration too about where the treaty sits in developing the size and scale of the assets we hold, and that includes state homes.
I think this is a very practical solution. I much would rather than a big house that's unsuitable, that's cold to heat, that is difficult to manage in Remuera, instead be able to build 3 houses in another suburb, regardless of where that suburb is, because ultimately we need warm, healthy homes for people to live in. And this is a way of delivering that, not just holding on to an ideological view of that we have to, hold on to particular state assets. This is a stabilisation plan and it's still meant to end up with the same numbers. I've heard the criticism about the fact whether or not we should be growing, but this is not a selling plan. This is not a how can we reduce the amount of assets we have. It's about making assets that are actually going to fit the families and the people that need them.
Okay, thank you both. Leave it there. Thanks, Brigitte Morten, Husband.